So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Raimund Maurer, and I'm the co-organizer with Olivia of this year's conference, and I have the honor to introduce now our keynote speaker, John Ralfe. John Ralfe from John Ralfe Consulting. John Ralfe consults many British listed and non-listed companies, and also several serves on and also trustee boards on pension. And before that, he was he was the head of corporate finance at Booth, and in this time he was the first who moves a DB pension plan in a fully funded, in a fully matched funded situation, which was described by the Economist as a landmark event. So John is an expert on DB pension, and of course then he served as a specialist on many boards, government boards, and also on company, worked for many different companies, and now Ralfe is speaking on DB pension, dead, alive, or what? Ralfe. John Ralfe.
I don't need that. This one should be live. Everyone can hear me? This is being filmed apparently, so I'm going to try and not wander around too much. And if I am wandering around too much, you better shout. I've told Raymond I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and 20 minutes only. So he's going to turn off the mic at the end of 20 minutes because I want to have as much time as possible for questions. I did prepare, obviously, what I was going to say before I came, but I've added various things along the way, and I'm not sure whether, based on what we've already heard this morning, whether I shouldn't be, sort of tearing it up and starting again. Most of what we've heard, and I think most of what we're going to hear, is about DC in one way or another. We shouldn't forget about DB. We shouldn't forget about DB for all sorts of reasons. And when I first stumbled into pensions, and it was stumbling into pensions, it really was 20 years ago, pensions were hardly on the radar screen for UK companies and for US companies, I suspect. Companies made sure they gave a pension in line with their competitors, and the finance director wanted to know how much cash had to go in that year, but that was about it. And of course, during the bull market of the late 80s, 90s, with widespread contribution holidays, it was very easy for everyone, directors, shareholders, analysts, the rating agencies, just to forget about pensions altogether. I'm glad to say all of that's now changed, and the amount of time UK companies spend on their DB pensions has increased disproportionately, and it's now centre stage for many, many companies. And I think it's the same in the US, and if it isn't, it should be, and if it isn't, it will be. I do take it as read, and there were one or two comments, particularly from John in the last session, the other John, about DB, but I do absolutely take it as read, and I'm very happy to be challenged on it, but take it as read that private sector DB is absolutely dead in the UK and the US. Olivia, when I spoke to her last week, said, well, it's dead but not buried, which I think is right. So companies have long since closed to new members. Many are starting to close to existing members, and some are going as far as getting rid of the liability altogether through a buyout or a buy-in. And by the way, I wasn't quite sure what to call this. I was going to call this talk, if DB pensions didn't exist, would we invent them? I also take it as read that the job of the pension professionals here today and elsewhere, as part of the inevitable future of pensions being DC, it's the job of pension professionals to design and operate a cheap and transparent system, easier said than done, which people can understand and which doesn't gloss over investment and longevity risk. And dare I say, I think there were one or two things this morning which perhaps glossed over that. I want to touch on what's called in the UK so-called. So-called, of course, is a way of saying I think it's not true, it's twaddle, but so-called collective defined contribution, or CDC, which you may have heard of. which is advertised as a halfway house between DB and DC. It's generated more heat than light in the UK over the last few years. I won't have time to look at UK or US public sector pensions. That's a whole other topic in itself. Both the UK and the US have dangerous unresolved issues, and that's going to come back to bite everyone at some point. There are some very important institutional differences between the UK and the US, some of which have come out this morning, and I apologise for anything I say which doesn't apply to the US. There may also be some differences in terminology. Just 2 or 3 things to mention. In UK private sector defined benefit pension schemes, people earn a pension which will be increased in line with inflation in retirement. And that's a very, very big difference, obviously, between the UK and the US. From a practical point of view, and we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit, from a practical point of view, that makes matching or hedging that liability much more difficult in the UK because you've got to hedge inflation. And it also makes it more difficult because there are very, very few inflation-linked instruments that you can buy in the UK. I mean, basically, it's UK government gilts, index-linked gilts. So it's easier in the US. It's also easier in the US, and somebody mentioned it, that we have a very, very large, deep pool of credit. Many more companies issue long-term bonds in the UK than the US. The other thing I want to mention, we were talking about social security in the last little session. If you look at all the stuff from the OECD, the UK is pretty low down the list of countries when it comes to social security. The new pension is about £7,500 a year, so say $9,000. So as a percentage of replacement earnings, it's much lower, even in the land of free enterprise in the US. What that means is, again, the sort of discussion we were having towards the end of the morning session about, in some way or another, Social Security takes up the slack. You do clever things with Social Security. That does not work in the UK. It's also worth mentioning that the balance between state and private pensions, and it was Gordon Brown at the Labour Chancellor at some point in the late 1990s, the percentage of state pension to private pension is about 60-40. And he said, we want to change that the other way around. We want people to be saving much more, to be much less reliant on social security pensions. The final thing I want to say, and I haven't made a joke so far, I'm not suggesting this is a joke, but I haven't made a joke so far. The final thing I want to say about terminology is that the UK has pension schemes, not pension plans. And I do know, I was told a very long time ago, possibly the first time I spoke in America, that when you say pension scheme in the US, what you mean is pension scam. So I'll try to stick to pension plan, and if I do say pension scheme, I mean pension scheme, not pension scam. That's my introduction, Raymond, and I'm almost through the 20 minutes, so you better give me a kick. Well, we know that DB pension plans are increasingly mature. There are more pensioners taking money out. There are fewer current employees putting money in. And once plans are close to new members, and in the UK they've been closed maybe for 15 years or more, the proportion of liabilities represented by current employees can reduce very quickly given the employee turnover. And as the average age of active members increases, because there are no new members, the annual percentage cost of new pension promises goes up quite steeply, quite quickly. We've talked about longevity. It may be very good news for the individual, but it's certainly bad news for the sponsoring company. And a friend of mine, Ed Bartholomew there, who's more of an expert on longevity than I am, we've had various conversations about it. Longevity is just the big risk for pensions the world over. And I don't think there is any way of hedging that. There have been various attempts in the UK to do longevity swaps, but the trouble is everybody's short longevity. The government's short longevity, DB plans are short longevity, individuals are short longevity. Who is there on the other side? There isn't really anybody that can do that sort of hedge in any size. At this point, by the way, and again, sorry, I'm not signalling this as a joke. It isn't a joke. I hope you all realise that Buckingham Palace made a very, very important announcement this morning. I think it was time for my being... Olivia doesn't know. It's absolutely shameful, Olivia. I thought they were... Prince Philip is, quotes, retiring, so he's stepping down from frontline duties. He's 95, however, so the argument is that he's done his bit. And there are lots of jokes being made, of course, in the UK amongst pension wonks like me about, oh, well, you know, they're going to raise the state retirement age to 95 in line with that da-di-da-di-da. The politics of it are quite interesting because making an announcement like that during the general election, again, that's not a joke, making an announcement like that is quite something because you know, you're not supposed to remove focus from what's going on in the politics. But I think the Queen and Prince Philip have just had enough of the general election campaign, and it's only been going 10 days. So the bear market of 2000, 2003 and the financial crisis 2007 onwards reminded people, and again we've heard a bit about this morning, equities are just not the one-way bet that they used to think. Falling interest rates, even before QE, increasing present value of liabilities, boosting other assets, but overall increasing deficits. We've also had greater transparency, and I'm not an accountant, I sometimes sound like an accountant. We've had greater transparency in accounting, particularly what's called FRS 17 in the UK from 2000, and I know the US was a bit later in that. And proper accounting is absolutely crucial to proper pension risk management. It's the old thing, what gets measured gets managed. And even actuaries, and I know there are a few actuaries sitting in the audience today. I'm not going to be too rude about them. I'm usually quite rude, but I'm not going to be too rude. Even actuaries have woken up to market-based and more transparent valuations. So all these challenges to conventional pension DB wisdom forced companies to recognise that making pension promises and delivering those promises cost much more and is much riskier than they thought. All in all, companies are trying to get out of the pensions business as quickly as possible. One of the first people I consulted for, going back quite a few years now, he said it's absolutely bonkers that an employer is underwriting how long employees live. And you think, well, yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, we don't provide company cars. We certainly should not be in the business of underwriting how long people live. I think what I was just about to say applies to the US as well as the UK, but again, I apologise if it doesn't, but I think it does. It's very, very easy to look back to a golden age of defined benefit pensions, but as with most exercises in nostalgia, it's a very partial view. So even at the peak, in the UK and the US, private sector workers and DB pensions, the percentage was quite small. DB pensions worked against people who changed jobs or had career breaks, particularly women. The main winners, surprise, surprise, mainly men, of a final salary pension were the management who'd left school, left university, stayed with the same company. Absolutely fantastic, you know, they end up... There used to be something which was recognised by the English IRS, and it was called a top hat scheme, and it was called a top hat scheme. There was a whole section, basically, on executive pensions. It was called the top hat scheme. When I was first told that, I thought I was having my leg pulled, but no, it's true. And guess what? The people who benefited were the people who were making the decision. Again, the other main winners were the hangers-oners, the fund managers, the actuaries, the investment consultants, who have made obscene amounts of money from defined benefit pensions along the way. And the accounting and regulatory framework allowed companies to pretend that they could turn a small cash contribution into a large pot to fund a pension just by holding equities. Very easy. And again, somebody said earlier, all fund managers looked clever when real returns are, as they have been. Now, I've had Olivia slightly worried about this, so Olivia needn't be worried any longer. I told Olivia I didn't have any slides, but I had some props, so she was a bit worried about what these props were going to be. You need worry no longer. You need worry no longer. It took me quite a bit of time, a few years, from being involved with pensions, talking to actuaries, talking to other people, to work out what the real secret of defined benefit pensions is. The real secret of defined benefit pensions is contained in this bag. I haven't rehearsed this, you see. So, the real secret of defined benefit pensions is the actuary's magic pencil. That is the actuary's magic pencil, which I've got to give back. I've only got it on loan. There's a US version of this, which possibly is even bigger. And that's being passed around all the public sector plans just at the moment. The actuary's magic pencil could make assets bigger than they actually were, and they could make liabilities smaller than they actually were. So that's the secret. And of course, the actuary's magic pencil needs an actuary's magic pencil sharpener. So for those very, very hard sums, you've got to have a sharp point. And if you got it wrong, because you didn't come up with the answer that the sponsor wanted, there's an actuary's magic eraser as well. And I have got to give that back. And don't tell the Institute of Actuaries that I've borrowed it, because otherwise they'll get very, very cross. Let's just go back to accounting and the importance of proper measurement, which, again, I can't emphasise too much. Traditional accounting allowed the economics of pension cost and pension fund investment risks to be hidden. Pension liabilities and assets were off balance sheet. The values were opaque even to pension experts. When I worked at Boots, we said to the actuary, well, look, everybody does this competitive analysis. Why don't you do some competitive analysis on Boots' retail competitors? And he said, well, I can't. I said, well, of course you can. No, the information that's provided in the annual report just didn't allow you to do that analysis. So the gains and losses for the asset and liability mismatch were hidden, the P&L smoothed. It looked as though the pension fund holding equities had the superior expected return of equities with the lack of volatility versus the liabilities of gilts or treasuries. Absolutely fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And the way in which the accounting used to work, as share prices went up in the 80s, 90s, that's the Institute of Actuaries ringing to say, can they have their magic pencil back, please? As the reported accounting surpluses increased, cash contributions went down. The way in which the accounting worked meant that company profits went up. Guess what? Hey presto, a vicious circle that share prices went up. I was absolutely fascinated, by the way, this paper from Paul Samuelson, which I haven't read. I mean, this is just an absolutely typical Paul Samuelson phrase: alternative social contrivances. Absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to mention another paper, so I'll see you, Paul Samuelson, and raise you somebody else. But as well as the conventional challenges to DB pensions, there's the much more fundamental challenge from financial economics. Conventional wisdom treats the DB pension fund as a self-contained entity with a life of its own, a bit like my pension pot, your pension pot. But it isn't like that. It's just a legal vehicle through which the employer delivers the pension, promised pension. It's an unconsolidated subsidiary. And I think, and I'm very happy to be proved wrong, I think that the conclusion that pension assets and liabilities should be matched, companies holding bonds, not equities, goes all the way back to Fisher Black in 1980. Slightly, not terribly sexy title of the paper, The Tax Consequences of Long-Run Pensions Policy. So it's a brilliant paper. And the message in that paper was pretty well ignored. It was pretty well ignored in practice for a very, very long time, almost 20 years. But it was picked up by some actuaries in the UK who started to apply financial economics principles to their actuarial work. Happens to be the 20th anniversary last week, 28th of April for those taking notes, of what I think is the most important and most influential paper to have been written on DB pensions in a very, very long time. Written by three, as they were 20 years ago, young actuaries, Exley, Mater and Smith, called The Financial Theory of Defined Benefit Pensions. And I'm sure Olivia can put a link on it. They presented it 20 years ago last week to the UK Institute of Actuaries, which got a very, 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 very frosty reception. I wasn't there, but it did. If you haven't read it, download it, and you're in for a treat. And of course, once you've accepted that a DB fund is part of the company, the asset allocations to be managed as part of the company's overall capital structure, not in isolation. It's not a self-contained bit that just happens to have the same name as the sponsoring company. How are we doing for time? Okay, thank you. Holding equities in the pension fund is the same as having debt on balance sheet. It changes the company's capital structure, it increases financial risk, it increases leverage. The financial economics conclusion, it does go back to Fisher Black, is that company pension liabilities should be matched with long-dated bonds, and the company, having reduced risk in the pension scheme, there's the one slipped out, should then gear up on balance sheet through a share buyback. And this is what Boots did in 2000 and 2001. It's one of the 30 largest pension funds, about £2.3 billion. Sold all the equities and moved 100% into long-dated AAA matching bonds, including, picks up a point I made earlier, about 50% inflation-linked, because the 50% fixed, 50% inflation-linked is a pretty good proxy for the underlying liabilities that have to be matched. And then Boots then completed the circle, buying back £300 million of its own shares. Now, I have thought about DB pensions for quite a long time, and I actually think that it isn't a question of, if there's only some way of fixing them. I actually think there's a fundamental problem with DB pensions, and I don't think that they're economically efficient. Again, I'm very happy to be challenged on it. It seems to me that the real cost to the employer of providing a DB pension, guaranteeing a DB pension, is almost always more than the perceived benefit to the employer. So if an employer has to pay $50,000 a year to attract and retain somebody for a particular job, they can either pay $50,000 cash or $40,000 cash and $10,000 in deferred pay, the real cost of the pension. Most people will take the $50,000 cash. Now, that value gap is partly to do with education, it's partly to do with myopia, it's partly to do with all those sorts of things, but I think it's more fundamental. Better education can reduce the gap, but I think that the value of the DB pension is always going to be more than the cost, since the employee should discount the future value of the pension payment at a higher discount rate, therefore a lower present value, than the company to compensate for the concentrated risk represented by the employer promise. Some of that is hedged to having assets, not all of it, and also the specific longevity risk. I'll just touch a little bit on CDC, collective defined contributions, which there was a lot of talk about them 3 or 4 years ago. The previous but one, but two pensions ministers seem to be very keen on them. The idea is that there's no pension promise. The company and the individual save into a collective fund, but there is the expectation that the fund will perform in such a way that they'll be able to produce a pension, and that pension will be higher than if you were simply doing it on your own. And guess what? The idea is that because it's got a longer time horizon, where have we heard that from, than any single individual, the CDC plan can take more investment risk, more equities, generating higher investment returns. And the fans in the UK point to the Netherlands as the model, which actually understands Dutch pensions big time. But the problem with CDC is it's the familiar argument that the risk that equities will earn less, will underperform, decreases with time, so hey presto, long-term pension savers should hold more equities. But that's based on exactly the same myth as the DB myth. And I'm very clear that although CDC can transfer investment risk from one member to another, or even one generation to another, the trouble is you're the last generation and you're left picking up the pieces, it's certainly not a magic wand to make risk disappear. And what I always say to people, and there are lots and lots of people who say, oh, no, we've got all this stochastic modelling, we can demonstrate that, risk reduces. Say, okay, well, that's fine. The acid test is that if CDC does work, and that there is some, free lunch to be had, then investment banks should be prepared to guarantee long-term equity outperformance to individual savers. So in other words, you buy something from Vanguard. I know they're not an investment bank. You buy something from Vanguard which says, ping, ping, you get bonds plus as a guarantee. And of course, if it's true that holding equities for the long term, blah, 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 you can see where I'm going. If it does lead to higher average returns with negligible risk, the cost of doing that should be pretty small. And of course, if a company is daft enough to say, look, we want to provide a DB pension, they should just be picking up the phone to an insurer, Prudential, UK Prudential, US Prudential, and saying, look, what does it cost to buy a deferred annuity? Answer, you don't get much of a deferred annuity for a contribution of, let's say, 20%. Have I got a couple more minutes, Raymond? Okay. There are various things that came out this morning that I would have liked to say on DCA. Maybe I'll have a chance to say it. It's come out in the questions. DC pensions are relatively new in the UK. Most people who weren't in a DB pension didn't have any pension. They have the state pension. We've now got auto-enrolment. I'm slightly schizophrenic about whether auto-enrolment is a good thing or a bad thing. Something like 7 million people are saving. It's a tiny percentage of salary. It's going up to 8%. Most with a company called Nest, which is set up by the UK government. They have a very good website, by the way. They do a lot of good research, sort of fundamental research, as well as providing good stuff for the individual members. The final thing that I want to say, and I'm not even going to whip out my second prop. You'll never know. You'll have to invite me back next year, Olivia. It used to be until quite recently that people who had a DC pot in the UK had to buy an annuity. The only circumstance in which they couldn't buy an annuity is if they had guaranteed income. In other words, they'd been in a DB scheme and had then moved into DC, of £20,000. So the logic was, if you've got £20,000, you are not going to be on means-tested state benefits. So therefore, you can basically do what you like. That's all changed. 2015, people can do what the hell they like. There are lots of people who think it's absolutely fantastic. It was a political move. There was no consultation. There was no discussion. It got the Conservative government quite a lot of votes, I suspect. I'm not a fan, as you may guess. I think I'm going to leave it there, Raymond, because I'd rather have questions from the floor.
Okay. John, thanks a lot. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand. Okay. Identify.
Stacy Schaus with PIMCO. I love the pencil. That was awesome. Great props. I'd love you to complete your thought. Just continue talking a little bit about the annuitization and what you would do with DC.
That's unfair. That makes it look as though I've planted you, so that if I run out of time, I'm going to. The decision not to have an annuity, not to require an annuity in the UK, was entirely political. There have been various toings and froings, and this idea that you didn't have to have an annuity if you had a guaranteed income of £20,000 was only introduced in 2011. It was only introduced in 2011. The right thing to do would have been to say, okay, let's see how that goes for 5 years. Does it make sense to reduce that a bit from 20 to 18? Let's see how that goes. At the other end, and I can never remember, and maybe some UK folks will correct me, I can never remember what the minimum amount is, because there's this thing about we'll call trivial cash commutation. If you have a tiny DB pension scheme, you were always allowed to take that as cash, because it was totally inefficient to be expected to go and take £5,000 and buy an annuity. I seem to remember it's £30,000, but anyway, whatever that was, that could have been increased. So you say, okay, well, let's see how things go. If it was 30,000, let's increase it to 40,000. What I would have liked to have seen, and I suggest it, which was, was entirely ignored, not surprisingly, what I would have liked to have seen is to say, okay, you have to buy a deferred annuity. So you have to say, okay, you're choosing to retire at 65. What is the average life expectancy for a man, for a woman? It's 88 or 89 or whatever. Okay, you have to take a part of that pot and you have to buy a deferred annuity. So you do not end up through, if you like, no fault of your own, not because you're stupid, not because you're profligate, just because you're living longer. you end up on your uppers. And that's for sort of moral and philosophical reasons, obviously, but it's also because the UK state isn't going to see people starving in the gutter, so it'll come back to taxpayers anyway. But that's what I think should have been done. But there was no discussion, no debate, no nothing. It was just done at the budget in, I guess it was 2014.
Follow on to that. So since they took away the requirement, I know those that have annuitized has dropped dramatically. Can you comment on the rate change or what type of payout you would get in an annuity? Because having a market that required annuitization, it seemed that worked against those that were going to get an annuity because the rates were significantly lower than what we could have here in the U.S., for instance. And there are many factors to that.
You've asked a very good question that I don't know the answer to. Even when interest rates are about the same, which they are now and have been for a while, and even when longevity is about the same, traditionally the US has lagged, I think, the UK. But like for like. Now, I don't know whether it's, there are conspiracy theories, it's all down to over-regulation. Or it could be a smaller pencil. All down to over-regulation from Brussels, requiring insurance companies to hold more capital. That might be part of it, but I don't know. I think the idea that annuities are a bad thing because they are expensive. Yes, we know what people mean by that, but they're not expensive because insurance companies are making off like bandits. They're expensive because interest rates are low and buying the bonds to hedge this. And there was a paper that I remember reading, and I haven't been able to find, I have looked for it, that was written in about probably 2005 by the Institute of Actuaries saying all insurance companies structurally in the UK for the previous 20 years had understated longevity improvements and had lost money, which is not to say that would continue. But the answer to the specific question, why is it more expensive in the UK? I don't know, but it is. But I suspect that's only part of it. The fundamental thing is, look, providing a guarantee is expensive. It is expensive.
Additional questions from the floor? Okay.
Hi, I'm Cindy Pagliaro from Vanguard. So the question is, you have pensioners now who don't have annuities. They have lump sums. What are they doing with the money?
It is genuinely a bit too early to tell, but the theory is that they will sit down and draw off an amount each month in order to meet their living expenses. In conjunction with Vanguard or whoever, they will work out what the optimal allocation, the asset allocation is, and they will also take a stab at how long they're going to live. And I think it was Bill Sharp who said how much to draw down in retirement is the most difficult financial decision anybody can ever be expected to take. The idea that it's just farmed out to people, anybody. I'm not being patronising. It's not a question. You can have a Wharton MBA, and that doesn't make you any better equipped. Or you can work for Vanguard, it doesn't make you any better equipped. But the logic is that you have a pot and you draw down amounts of money. In the UK, by the way, there's a little extra wrinkle which you don't have in the US. 25% of your pension pot can be taken tax-free, and you can do that over time or you can take it in a lump sum. It appears as though quite a lot of people are taking the money and running and actually pushing themselves into a higher tax band, which doesn't make any sense for the individual, but it's fantastic for the Treasury. But I think, and I'm not wanting to sound too cynical, I think the answer to your question was not properly thought through by George Osborne, the former Chancellor, who made the decision. And I repeat, there was no consultation, there was no discussion, and a lot of the practicalities of, okay, well, how do you do this, have proved to be quite difficult. It's not because the insurance companies or pension funds are being difficult, it's just quite a difficult thing to do.
One last question.
So, identify yourself, please.
Ed Bartholomew, independent consultant. Thank you, John. That was great. In the U.S., if I remember the numbers correctly, about half of the population doesn't have any pension scheme at all by their employer, and it's an issue that we're wrestling with. I wonder if you could just talk about, is it similar in the UK, and what efforts are you making?
It is. The 7.5 million people that are now in auto-enrolment have had between probably 2% and 8% put in. So they're included in the figures. The government, the DWP say, we've now got... In a way, I don't count them. I certainly don't count them for the next 10 years. I don't have the precise figures, but it is the same, if not worse, than in the US. And again, I have to say that makes sense. If you are a low earner, you've got very, very many more calls on your, what's coming in each week, each month, than saving for a pension.
So maybe a last question from my side, as a moderator, and also as a member of the German Societies of Actuaries. I remember that with a pencil, and we'll have a look what it is here. At the end of the day, we know that having a lifelong income is something which is positive. I think we agree on that. And the question is how we get it. There are some issues that we should get it over a defined pension plan offered by a company, and everybody knows also that the idea of a deferred annuitization is also something great. The question is how we get people through that. We in Germany, we make this by a mandatory annuitization. We do that, so we require that people annuitize their individual retirement accounts, a part of them, into a deferred annuity starting at the age of 85. I don't know if this is the solution for the rest of Europe, and especially not for the US, but maybe default solutions, that you say a part of your pension at the age of retirement is converted into a deferred annuity, which allows especially the people which are in another good health situation to say, okay, I don't want to have that. Maybe this is what the last question before we stop.
I think deferred annuities have a lot going for them. The trouble is, behaviourally, if people don't like buying annuities because they're too expensive, they certainly don't like buying deferred annuities. People don't like buying insurance. People misprice insurance. So you say, okay, you're 65, you're 80. Can it be done without, you use the word mandatory, can it be done without it being mandatory? I don't think so. Is there any political will in the UK? Definitely not. Is there any political will in the US? You tell me, but I doubt it.